Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will be delivering her fall economic statement on Thursday. And she has already made it clear that there won't be a lot of money to help Canadians cope with inflation. Ms. Freeland has been pointing out lately that doing so would just further fuel inflation. Instead, she is setting the stage for an economic statement which focuses on the economy of the future. It's one that is heavily focused on clean power, electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, and critical minerals. Ahead of the budget, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation recently appeared before the House of Commons Finance Committee. Now, this was to provide their own plan for the federal budget. With us now to unpack this plan is the CTF's federal director, Franco Terrazzano. Mr. Terrazzano, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
So, can you unpack your pre-budget submission for our viewers?
Absolutely. I mean, the most important recommendation is to bring spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already at all-time highs. And if the government did that, it would balance the budget next year. Now, here's why that's so important. The government was already spending all-time highs before the pandemic in 2018, which means that the Trudeau government in 2018 spent more money than the feds did during any single year during World War II, even after accounting for inflation and population growth. So with overspending like that for years, finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean.
And what kind of response did you get from officials regarding this submission, Mr. Terrazzano?
Well, we were there essentially to tell them that it's time to end the party with taxpayers' money. Now, they're going to hear from hundreds of individuals and groups asking them to spend more, but we were there asking them to spend less. So we were there to say no more wasting $8,800 on a sex toy show in Germany, no more racking up nearly $100,000 on fancy airplane food during a week-long trip, no more giving members of parliament pay raise after pay raise after pay raise while their constituents struggle through a pandemic, and no more giving big corporations buckets of cash, which is known as corporate welfare.
So, what would a plan or this plan look like for everyday Canadians if it were to be implemented, and how would it help them fight inflation?
Well, the government, if they adopt the plan, would be able to balance the budget next year, which means that they would have room to provide tax relief and reverse the tax hikes, which are harming so many Canadians, which are making it more expensive to fuel up your car with gas or put ground beef in your grocery cart. Look, it should have been a no-brainer that at the very least, the federal government not raise taxes during the pandemic when people were losing their jobs, losing their business, or taking pay cuts. But unfortunately, we saw the federal government raise the carbon tax, raise alcohol taxes, and take more money from workers through payroll tax hikes.
Now, we mentioned that Ms. Freeland has warned that Canadians cannot be supported the way we were during the height of the pandemic. She said it would fuel inflation. So, how would going back to pre pandemic spending impact inflation?
Well, we need to see the government reduce its spending. Spending more money on everything forever is not sustainable, and that's what's driving inflation. I mean, we saw the government overspending for years. Then, during the pandemic, the Bank of Canada printed $300 billion right out of thin air, largely by buying Government of Canada debt. That is the inflation tax. And of course, the cherry on top, which is driving inflation, are the inflationary tax hikes, like the gas tax hikes, like the taxes that are increasing alcohol every time you go to pick up that 2-4 or the bottle of Pinot Noir. So, what our plan would allow the government to do would be able to reduce its spending and lower taxes.
Now, on the other hand, amid inflation and climbing interest rates, is it realistic for the government to consider cutting spending, which might impact social services that people are relying on, Mr. Terrazzano?
Well, all we're saying is bring spending back to pre-pandemic levels of 2018-19, which were already all-time highs. I mean, if you can remember back to 2018, nobody was calling that budget austerity. This is very realistic, and the government could balance its budget next year just by bringing spending back to the pre-pandemic levels. But look, there's a ton of government spending that needs to be trimmed. Remember, the federal government gave 300,000 bureaucrats a pay raise during the middle of the pandemic when their neighbors in the private sector lost their job, took cuts, or lost their business, and that's not fair. Let's also not forget that the government is giving failing crown corporations like the Bank of Canada, like the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporations, bonuses during the middle of the pandemic. And also, the government doesn't need to be announcing $295 million for the Ford Motor Company or more than $300 million for Bombardier.
Lots to think about, Mr. Terrazzano. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
Stay with us. After the break, we're going to have a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. A Canadian is among the injured after a deadly crowd surge in South Korea. Over 130 people are killed after a bridge collapses in India. Saudi Arabia and the UAE defend oil production cuts, and EU inflation hits another record high in October. So stay tuned for these stories and more stories from around the world. Forum Daily will be right back after this short break. Stay with us.